very proud to introduce a childhood friend of mine. Kara and I grew up in the same small group with two other families besides ours, and so we've known each other for a very long time. Kara, before graduating student at university, it just became a university.
It was
the next day. It was right next year, so it became the university. She then moved to Iowa. Worked for a while at a small Quaker school, attended the Iowa Center for Writers and Playwriting, a prestigious organization, and then shifted the way she wrote and went to law school and did that. She's worked with immigration issues she's worked with immigration issues since the time she graduated. She did some voluntary service down at the border, Texas-Mexico border early on, and that sort of sparked the fire in her. She is currently a federal public defender in San Diego and has been working with immigration issues in Texas, Arizona, and California for about 25 years. Okay.
Can you hear me okay? Does that work all right? Okay. First of all, thank you all for coming. Does that sound strange? Or is that right? Okay. Thank you all for coming. Obviously, immigration is a huge issue right now, and one of the things that I'm going to talk about a little bit today is how helpful some of the interest and advocacy has been among people in groups like this, and how valuable that has been to the work that I've done for a number of years. I talked to Julia before, what's your last name now? Julia Olivan, and it dawned on me that some of you may want to know who my parents are. My parents are, is it still working? My parents are Ken and Betty Hartzler. They now live in Belleville, Pennsylvania. They lived in Heston, Kansas for a number of years, but I know how nice it is to kind of know where someone came from and who some of their family members are. So, without further ado, I'm going to talk a little bit about what I've done over the last 25 years. And the format that I'm going to do it in is a little bit different. And this format came out of something that Vernon Jancy sent to me, the email that he sent to me. The email that Vernon Jancy sent to me saying, you know, what they were looking forward to in terms of me talking, and it went something like this. We'd like to give you the opportunity to share what's on your heart as the preachers in Movavi, Michigan always begin their sermons. So I'm going to take Vernon Jancy up on this, and I am going to do what I don't usually do in presentations, which is I'm going to allow myself to kind of rant. Maybe full-blown rant about immigration. It would be a gentle, kind rant, but I'm going to try and essentially talk about some of the things that are going on in immigration right now and how they either give me hope or don't give me hope. So there are things that make me lose hope right now when we talk about immigration. Can I still? No. Okay. Okay. I thought we could get that help. Okay, can you hear this? All right. That works. There we go. Okay, we're good. Okay, so what about immigration right now makes me lose hope, and what gives me hope? And when I decided to sort of talk about it like in this format. I made myself a promise that I was going to give equal shrift to both sides, that I was going to talk about just as many things that gave me hope as that made me lose hope right now. And I thought that that was going to be a huge challenge, and I probably wouldn't be able to do it. But actually, it wasn't as hard as I thought it would be. And so, in no particular order, what I'd like to do this morning is kind of talk about things that give me hope, things that don't give me hope. I'm very open to any questions as we go through. We can also have some question time afterwards. But if there's something burning that I'm talking about that you want to ask me, please just raise your hand. And I know we may not have another mic, but I can repeat your question so that everyone can hear it. So feel free to interrupt me as we go through. I'm very happy to be interrupted. All right. So as you can probably pick up from this, what makes me hope are things in red. What makes me lose hope is in red. What gives me hope in green. So if you want to try and keep track of it that way. One of the things that makes me lose hope is a line that I think we've heard for probably the past 10 or 15 years. And that is, first we have to secure the border. Before we do comprehensive immigration reform, before we do anything, first we have to secure the border. And in my opinion, that is one of the most misleading, problematic ways of approaching immigration that you could possibly do. Why is that? Well, because everyone's idea of what securing the border is completely different. If you look at the rate of apprehensions along the southwest border for the last 50-some years, what you can see is that there was a kind of upward trend up until about 1986, and then there was a huge spike around 2000. But for the past 20 or so years, it's gone down pretty precipitously. And I just looked up the stats, it ends in 2016, but I just looked up the stats for 2017 and 2018, and they're a little bit above 2016, but they're right around what they were in 1976. So when we're talking about securing the border, I'm not sure what people mean other than, well, we want to create this false illusion, this false goal that can never be met. We want to keep sort of moving the yardstick, and no matter what you do, and no matter how many drones or helicopters or Border Patrol officers you put down on the border, it's never going to be enough. And so because it's never going to be enough, we can never get to any kind of comprehensive immigration reform. So if there's one phrase that drives me up the wall, it's that first we have to secure the border, because I don't know what that means. I don't know when you have secured the border. Does it have to be down to 0? Does it have to be below that line? And as long as we keep creating this sort of illusion of a benchmark that we have to hit before we get any kind of legislative fix, I think we're going to be in a problematic situation. We are in it right now. What gives me hope? Dreamers. Dreamers give me a lot of hope. Not because I think that they are necessarily going to, there's going to be a great answer anytime soon. I'm not sure there is. I can't guarantee there is. But what gives me hope about the Dreamers is that they were a totally new movement that no one anticipated. I started doing immigration law in 1994. And for the first while I would do it until, I would say the first, decade and a half that I was doing it, anyone who was undocumented was not going to come out and go to protests and, announce their presence in the United States and sort of dare the immigration officials to come and arrest them and put them into deportation proceedings. It just didn't happen. And so when this phenomena of Dreamers began, and we started seeing people come out in caps and gowns and saying, I'm undocumented, and announcing it at their, when they gave their valedictorian speech, I was blown away by the courage that it took to do that. And it was such an inspirational thing for me to see young people who could have everything that they'd ever known taken away from them and who are willing to stand up. And if they can do it, you know, how much can the rest of us do it when we have so much less at stake than they do? So dreamers give me a lot of hope, and they continue to. Erosion of protections for asylum seekers is probably the most troubling thing that I've seen in the last year. I am a critic of most administrations when it comes to immigration. I think Bill Clinton did some pretty awful stuff that I'll talk about in a bit. I think Obama, you know, was known as the porter-in-chief. There were also some great things that Obama did, but you know, I'm an equal opportunity critic in terms of some of the administration's policies. But what we have seen as immigration lawyers in the last year and a half is kind of on a whole new level. It is the systemic erosion of any kind of protection for people who are seeking asylum in the United States. Not only is it an erosion, it is quite possibly one of the cruelest series of erosions that I have seen in terms of the legal developments, in terms of the treatment of asylum seekers, and I'll just go through a couple reasons why, or a couple things that I've seen. First of all, there is a narrowing of the legal definition of who qualifies for asylum. Many of the asylum seekers that are coming to the southwest border right now are seeking asylum on the basis of a lot of the gang violence, cartel violence, domestic violence that's going on in Central America and other parts of Mexico and South America. And one of the things that the administration right now is doing is they're coming out with new legal precedent that says that those types of claims are no longer something that qualifies a person for asylum. And so that is a huge development, and it's been sort of overturned about 20 years or so of increasingly positive law that has been made in this area of asylum. And so to see that kind of setback and say, no, the types of claims that people have been winning for 20 years no longer are going to get you asylum, that is hugely, hugely concerning to me. You've probably seen a lot on the news about long lines at port of entries along the southwest border, that people are getting turned away. That is absolutely true. We started seeing that probably about 3 years ago, where someone has the right to go up to a person at the port of entry and say, you know, I request asylum. That normally what would happen is that person would, you know, they would be taken into custody. They'd be allowed to, you know, go through the process. But now what started happening is that when people go up to the border and they say, I want to request asylum, the Border Patrol will say, oh no, actually, we're not doing that anymore. Asylum's not available anymore. Or at the very least, well, no, you have to wait. And as a result of that, there have been these sort of de facto lines that have formed. In the last 6 months or so, the line at the San Diego Port of Entry has gone up to, I think, 7,000 people. And they have this notebook. They have these notebooks where everyone writes down their name, and then the Border Patrol says, okay, well, we'll let in about anywhere from 30 to maybe up to 100 people, but usually about 30 or 40 people. And those 30 or 40 people are allowed that day to come in and apply for asylum. Everyone else has to wait. So you only have a very small portion of people who are being let in to apply for asylum. And when they are, then there's a lot fewer protections. So there's a real problem right now in terms of these camps, these lines, people who are congregating along the southern border, the southwest border, and living there for months and months and months while they're trying to wait to apply for asylum. Making a legal entry a bar. So most of the types of cases that I do right now, as technically I'm a criminal defense attorney, the cases that I do right now are cases that involve not necessarily keeping someone in the United States as part of their immigration case. I represent people who cross the border illegally and are charged with a crime. Now, I'll talk about this a little bit more later, but one of the things that has happened recently is this administration has tried to say that crossing the border illegally disqualifies you from being eligible for asylum. Now, that is directly contradicted by the language of the statutes itself. And in fact, one of the most conservative judges on the Ninth Circuit just flat said that is absolutely wrong. That is totally wrong. And so, but there's constantly these efforts to say, okay, well, even if it doesn't legally disqualify you, maybe if you came in without authorization, rather than waiting at the port of entry 3 or 4 months in a tent, then maybe you shouldn't get asylum as a matter of discretion. So there's these constant efforts to sort of push away and diminish the ability that people have to get asylum in the United States. And there's also the new Remain in Mexico policy. And the idea behind this is that if you have, say, a person who's coming from Central America, and they go to the port of entry and they apply for asylum, what the United States has done is it's basically created this policy with Mexico where it says, okay, well, you can apply for asylum, but while you're going through this process of applying for asylum, you have to stay and actually live in Mexico. So they've done this to about 250 people so far, and the irony is that they aren't very consistent about when the next hearing is. So for instance, there was a big kerfuffle about a week or 2 ago where someone said, okay, you've got a hearing on Wednesday, and so you have to show up at the port of entry at this day, at this time, and they'll drive you to your hearing in San Diego. But then they changed the date. They moved it up by like 4 days. And so they didn't have any way of telling the person who was in Mexico, oh, actually now your court date is on a different date. And so when the person didn't show up to be brought to their hearing, the immigration lawyer for the government was saying, oh, well, we have to deport them in absentia. So there's just all sorts of problems, logistical problems, first of all, in terms of this policy and trying to bring people back in. But one of the bigger issues, as you can kind of see from this list, is if you have long lines, and if you have a policy of making people wait in Mexico while they're doing their asylum case, what that essentially does is it encourages people to cross illegally. So in other words, numbers 2 and 4 encourage people to enter illegally, which then triggers number 3 and makes you ineligible for asylum. I am not necessarily by nature a conspiracy theorist, but I am a little bit conspiracy theorist when it comes to this. I think that some of the policies that are in place right now and are being added, to our pantheon of how we deal with immigration are designed to create a system where people are no longer eligible for the type of relief that they're trying to seek. Okay. What gives me hope? Good Samaritans. Out of all of this, horrible, cruelty, nasty policy stuff that's going on, in spite of that, there are still so many people doing amazing work here in Harrisonburg, on the border, all over the country. This is a picture of some Good Samaritans. Literally, that's the name of their organization, is the Good Samaritans. They go out and they leave water in the desert so that people who are crossing are less likely to become dehydrated and die in what can be a very dangerous crossing. There are people, this is a friend of mine, Joanna Williams, who runs a shelter in Nogales for people who are being deported and have nowhere to go once they get off this bus on the other side in Mexico. And they give them a place to stay for a couple of days. There are other people who are welcoming, who are providing all this assistance. And I think that there is a lot to be said for not just looking at, what are the really horrible things that are happening to immigrants right now, but who are the people who are stepping up? And who are the people who are taking their time to hike out to the desert, leave water, to give asylum seekers a home, to help families integrate once they're here, all of those things. I find a lot of hope in that. Family separations. So we started seeing family separations about like late last April and May is when they started. And the idea behind family separations is that if people are caught crossing the border with their children, then because there's this zero tolerance policy, and because the person is being criminally prosecuted for illegal entry, because you can't have a child in a prison with an adult, then essentially the children are going to be taken somewhere else, and the parents will be criminally prosecuted. What the practical import of this meant is that when people in my office would go out and talk to their clients for the first time and say, okay, well, I'm your public defender, I'm going to represent you in this criminal proceeding, that then the parent was so traumatized because all they could think about was, where is my kid? Is my kid going to be okay? Will I be able to get my kid back when this is over? You know, I might be able to plead to a crime and I'll get time served, but can I get my kid back afterwards? And this was understandably all-consuming to the point where we couldn't even have conversations with our clients because their heads were somewhere else. They couldn't even focus on what was in front of them in terms of, okay, this is the decision we need today, are you going to plead guilty, are you going to fight your case? And it was, in all honesty, not a situation where people can make a knowing, intelligent, and voluntary plea. That's kind of the standard that we have. Before you plead guilty to a crime, you have to say, the judge has to find that this is a knowing, intelligent, voluntary plea. If your head is so off somewhere else that you can't even focus and can't even understand what the charge is that you're pleading guilty to, then you're not making a plea. Then your ability to get out and get back and be reunited with your child is jeopardized. So it was a horrible, horrible situation. And to be fairly honest with you, it is still happening. Even though officially that policy has ended, there were certain exceptions that were made. So for instance, say that you had a shoplifting conviction from 20 years ago. You are technically a criminal alien, and criminal aliens are not subject to the bar on the family separation. So we talk to people every day who, my 4-year-old is in this giant tent in Texas. My, 8-year-old is I don't know where. And it is one of the worst logistical jobs I have ever seen by the government in terms of how little effort and money and time they put into thinking about how these kids were going to be reunited with their parents after the case was done. It was just a bureaucratic, absolute nightmare. But what gave me hope out of all of that was the outrage over family separations. When I started doing immigration in 1984, it was certainly something that people would talk about, but not every day. You didn't see the news every day. And that is one of the biggest things that I've seen change over the last, I would say, 5 years or so. Suddenly immigration always seems to be a headline. It's what people are talking about all the time. And so when this family separation came, I have my Facebook feed and I see people who I knew from EMU or high school or everything like that. Suddenly, I was seeing people who had never talked about immigration on Facebook, who had never posted anything political, who were absolutely horrified at what was going on with family separation. And they were posting things and they were asking them to donate. And it's strange, sometimes you never know what is going to sort of capture the consciousness of a nation. You don't know where the next big outrage is going to come from. But somehow, family separation hit a nerve in this country. And that nerve was really gratifying for me to see. That people that I didn't necessarily associate or think of as being someone who would get upset or become an immigrant advocate suddenly were. And I found that really heartening. New judges. So when the 2016 election was going on, I was obviously not a fan of Trump. But one of the things that I really knew was going to happen, and unfortunately has played out, is that it wasn't just having someone in for 4 years. It was having someone in for 4 years who was going to nominate judges who were going to be in for 30 or 40 years. And most of the work that I do right now is actually at the appellate level. I practice almost primarily in front of the Ninth Circuit, Court of Appeals. And the Ninth Circuit has traditionally had this reputation of being a very liberal circuit. And in some ways it is. In other ways, not so much. And I can tell you that when I had a case coming up, the single most important controlling factor about what is going to happen with that case is who the judges are. Because I can have the exact same case, and it will come out completely different depending on if it is Judge A versus Judge B. That is a discouraging thing for a lawyer who wants to believe that justice is blind and it should always be the same, and we have certain laws and they apply equally to everyone. Not true. Not true at all. And so one of the things that I really am concerned about is not just what's happening for these 4 years, it's what's going to be the legacy of judges who are appointed and really carry forward this type of mean-spirited approach to immigrants for the next 30 or 40 years. But what gives me hope is some of the new politicians. A month or two ago, there were 2 representatives who came down and they spent the night on the sidewalk with an asylum family, a family who was seeking asylum. And they were basically protesting this whole system of having to put your name in a notebook and wait and go through that whole process. They said, look, there's nothing legal about that. That's not how you're supposed to do it. And so they essentially made this statement where these 2 congressional representatives went and slept on the sidewalk on a really cold night, and they stayed with this family until officials let the family in. And you can watch video of this on the internet. And what struck me about the video is that these congressional representatives were functioning as protesters. They were acting like protesters. They were basically, they were, talking to the officials, and they were saying, you have to let them in, you have to do this. And that's always the language I would see of someone who was, a lawyer, an advocate. It's not the language that I'm used to seeing from congresspeople. So there was something really heartening, and that I gained a lot of hope from watching that. Dehumanizing rhetoric. So one of my extended family sent an email around to some people in our family, and it was, my mother forwarded it to me, and I saw it, and I'm just going to read it to you. So this email is explaining, why would you vote for Trump if you don't think he's a good person or that sort of thing. It says this: you've been on vacation for 2 weeks. Imagine this. You come home, and your basement is infested with raccoons. Hundreds of rabid, messy, mean raccoons have overtaken your basement. You want them gone immediately. You call the city and 4 different exterminators, but nobody can handle the job. That there's this one guy, and he guarantees to get rid of them, so you hire him. You don't care if the guy swears, you don't care if he's an alcoholic, you don't care how many times he's been married, you simply want those raccoons gone. And I read that, and I can't really express my reaction to it, but the idea that, the language that we're using in some of these is the language of raccoons, it's the language of cockroaches, it's not people who are fleeing desperate situations, it is the language of infestation. And that I find incredibly disturbing. And I find it incredibly disturbing that it is so prevalent and that it can be emailed out. And these are the kinds of things that really hurt my heart. To think about clients that I've had to be referred to like this. Positive images in pop culture. One of the new things that I've seen along with some of these are not just images of immigrants in pop culture, but positive images. Hamilton. It has this great line, immigrants, we get the job done. And a lot of the big themes of this very, very popular musical is immigrants and how they come and what they do and what they contribute to our country. I find that fact and the fact that there are a lot of young people who love this musical and are hearing that message over and over, I find wonderful. Roma, the music, the movie, I don't know if all of you saw it, but it's this beautiful movie of a director who grew up in Mexico City, and it's primarily focused on their indigenous housekeeper. And it really follows her story. And it's just the most quiet, beautiful movie with this indigenous woman as its heroine. And I love that. And not only did I love that, I loved the fact that she was then nominated for a Best Actress Oscar. And she went to the Oscars and she was wearing this beautiful dress. It was a huge shift in perception to see this woman who in many ways is considered, or has been considered for many years, to be sort of the bottom of the barrel of our social status. And yet, there she was, star of this amazing Oscar-nominated movie. And not only that, but you have Alfonso Cuarón, who was the director and writer of this movie, got up, and he would always get up to the mic and say, I love Mexico. Mexico's a wonderful place. And sometimes I don't feel like we always see countries where immigrants are coming from as being beautiful, rich, vibrant places that create the most amazing food and culture and music and arts and sciences. And so I love seeing those kinds of things in our pop culture. So you saw this picture earlier about the Good Samaritans. One of the things that I didn't tell you when I showed it the first time is that this was a spread in Vogue. There was this whole spread about the women of Arizona who are working on immigration. And Vogue, of all magazines, is highlighting women who are not 6'3" and rail thin, and they're highlighting women who are walking out in the desert in their 50s and 60s, and they're showcasing these women as heroines in society. I find that just fascinating. I still have a lot of problems with Vogue for other reasons, but I love that they did that. Operation Streamline. So, Operation Streamline is what I'm spending probably about 80% of my time on right now. It's existed since about 2005, and the idea behind Operation Streamline is that when you have people entering the United States, crossing the border illegally, if you have a zero-tolerance policy, if you arrest them and prosecute everyone who's caught doing this, then this will discourage other people from coming in to the United States illegally. So it started in 2005, it spread along the border, it came to Arizona in about 2008 while I was there, and just last July, it came to San Diego. San Diego was the last place on the border that didn't have Operation Streamline. So for years, in San Diego, for instance, there were certainly prosecutions, but they were for the more serious offense of illegally entering the United States after you'd already been deported. So, and even those cases, they only brought it against people who had pretty serious criminal histories or had come and gone many more times. So in 2017, my office, or actually I shouldn't say my office, in San Diego in 2017, there were 22 cases of misdemeanor illegal entry that were prosecuted. In 2018, there were 6,416. So someone did the math and figured it out that was a 29,000% increase in the number of cases. So suddenly we have the separate court that's been set up just to handle these misdemeanor entry prosecutions. And when this started, it was hearkening back to an era where there are separate courts for separate groups of people. And it's been an incredible challenge to figure out, how do we represent people? How do we, throw our weight, what little influence we have, to try to stop this? And it's been very all-consuming. So actually, one thing that gives me hope has been fighting Operation Streamline. This is a protest that took place in Arizona, actually, where people went out and they actually formed a human chain and around a bus, and they stopped the bus that day. This is a reference to Brown versus Board of Education, the seminal Supreme Court case where classrooms are desegregated. They said we can't have separate but equal in the classroom. And so one of the things that I have been trying to do is file a whole bunch of appeals to the Ninth Circuit, essentially saying that Streamline is the equivalent of Brown versus Board of Education, in that separate but equal doesn't work in the classroom, and it also doesn't work in the courtroom. Why? Because, first of all, you can never have something truly be separate but equal. It will always be unequal in some way. Second, as Brown v. Board of Education itself said in the decision, there is an inherent damage done whenever you segregate people. You are sending the explicit and implicit message that those people are not worthy of being in your system. They have to be in another system. So one of the things that I've tried to do with this appeal is essentially figure out all the ways that Streamline defendants are treated differently, and there are quite a few, than other defendants who are brought for other similar charges, and say that Streamline Court violates equal protection. So right now we have a lot of different cases going up that's challenging Streamline. We have about 300 total appeals pending on this. I'm probably going to be doing oral argument on it in the fall, and we probably won't win because we don't win most of these. But it's not just about winning, it's about calling it out. And it's about saying, you know what? When a white person is arrested in a national park for smoking marijuana, and they are subject to a 6-month misdemeanor, they aren't put in this court. They are given a citation and told to show up. And then most of the time, about 98% of cases, they are able to do diversion, and they don't have this on their record, and they're not held in jail, and they're not shackled. And so the idea is to basically say, why are we treating this misdemeanor so much more differently than every other misdemeanor in our federal courts? So that's the idea, and I'm enjoying it. It's fun. Okay, mandatory minimums for illegal entry and re-entry. If there's one thing that chills my blood when I think about what could go wrong in terms of legislative issues and new bills that could come out, one of them is mandatory minimums for people who I represent. There is often some sort of trade-off, and they say, well, we'll give you comprehensive immigration reform, but then we're going to say that, people who come in illegally are going to be subject to 1-year mandatory minimum. People who come back illegally are going to be subject to a 5-year mandatory minimum. And I think that that is possibly one of the most punitive, horrible things I've ever heard in my life. Right now, immigration defendants, immigration-based crimes, comprise at least 50% of all federal crimes. So when you think about federal crimes, you normally think about terrorism or drug trafficking or treason or sort of the big picture ones. You don't think about immigration, and yet, 50% of everything that we prosecute in federal courts is immigration related right now. What gives me hope? Abolishing illegal entry as a crime. In the last year, for the first time, I've been talking to some organizations that say, no, we're going to actually start talking to politicians about the idea of just saying that this is no longer a crime. And it blew my mind, and it still kind of blows my mind because I'm so used to this idea of course it's a crime, yes, we punish this. But it's become a bigger and bigger rallying cry that I have heard recently. And so the idea that people are able to do something as audacious as say, no, this shouldn't be a crime anymore, blows me away, and I love it. And I'm really excited, even though, again, it probably won't work. But the fact that they're even proposing it, that they're even saying, this isn't something that we should call a crime, I find very cool. The Supreme Court. So the Supreme Court is going in a direction that is very troubling to me and disturbing to me. I think that was shown by the decision on the travel ban last year. One of the things that I notice about the Supreme Court and the justices, because I read, a lot of their decisions, and I have to sort of understand their mindset to be able to do this well, to be able to do this job. And one of the things that I notice is that there are motivations for a lot of cases and a lot of decisions. And what I see as the overarching theme of probably at least 5 of the Supreme Court justices right now is an inability to empathize, an inability to see that there are people who did not come from your background who deserve some sort of mercy or some sort of, I guess just an inability to relate to someone who is not from your type of privileged upbringing. I specifically think of this with Justice Alito. I can't think of the last case where Justice Alito didn't side with the party that had more power. And that's what it comes down to, is that there is a real trend on the Supreme Court to say, I am going to side with whoever it is who has more resources, more power, who is in a better position than the underdog. And one of the things that, for instance, I'll give a couple examples. Qualified immunity is a concept that if you are a police officer and you accidentally shoot an African American man, that you are not liable for that. You can't be sued for that. The law on this area has gotten progressively worse in the last 10 years because the Supreme Court has narrowed that, the ability of law enforcement officers to be held accountable. There's a great law professor who gives these lectures about the Supreme Court, and he said, you can almost always predict what the Supreme Court is going to do by whether the justices could put themselves in the shoes of the defendant. In other words, there was a case that came out called Carpenter a year or two ago, and the idea was, well, could police use your cell phone data to track you and to follow you around and figure out where you were? And the justices said no. Why? Because the justices all have cell phones and they don't want to be tracked. So, whereas if you have a defendant who is poor, who came from a very difficult background, who is a person of color, that the justices have a very hard time putting themselves in that person's shoes and thinking about, why should I rule for this person? So that is a real challenge, the Supreme Court. Now, ironically, what also gives me hope? The Supreme Court. Why? Because what I think that we need to do, what I as a lawyer need to do to respond to where it's going is not to say, well, we lost it, that's it, we can't do anything. I need to be smarter. I need to figure out what is going to motivate those justices that I wouldn't necessarily agree with, and how am I going to frame my case, how am I going to frame my story in a way that does appeal. So for instance, there's a lot of justices who really, really hate federal agencies. And Border Patrol and ICE and the immigration courts are all agencies. And so rather than frame my argument in a, here's my client, he's very deserving, he's been here since he was 10 days old, you know, he's going to be separated from his family, that just falls on deaf ears. What I need to now say is, here's this agency, and they're overstepping their power, and you need to rein them in. That is your job. An example of this is last year, there was a case, and it was kind of a really technical legal issue, but it had real impact for thousands of people. And I wrote a friend of the court brief on this case. I do not harbor any illusions that my brief made any difference whatsoever. But what myself and other people did is we framed this towards Justice Gorsuch. And we framed it in a way that we knew he liked these issues to be presented. And we won because we got Justice Gorsuch. And as a result, we had thousands and thousands and thousands of people who did less prison time. So I don't think that would have happened, frankly, if Merrick Garland were here. And there's other cases that I would have certainly rather had Merrick Garland than Justice Gorsuch. But the challenge now is not to give up, but to figure out, how do we get smarter? How do I get more strategic? How do I frame my case in a way that I can win Justice Gorsuch rather than just not make it'll ever happen again? All right, what gives me some pain is expedited removals. One of the things that you can see from this chart is that over time, the number of cases that are decided by immigration judges is a fraction of what it once was. In other words, on this last one that you can see in 2012, basically the dark part is cases that were decided by immigration judges. Other cases in there were either people who were voluntarily returned, but mostly the red and blue are cases where people were removed by Border Patrol officers. And what happens when people are removed by Border Patrol officers because they were caught a certain distance from the border or because they had a prior order, is Border Patrol officers aren't accountable to anyone. We can't go after them in court. We can't say, oh, you messed up this order, or you did this, because in almost every case, there is no legal avenue for us to challenge the fact that this Border Patrol officer said, oh no, he didn't tell me he was scared to go back. So that is a huge concern because there is increasingly a black hole of cases where people are deported, but there's no way for us as lawyers to get at it. There's no way to go after those orders. Movement towards universal representation. Now, even though this is an incredibly sad picture, because it represents the idea of children who have to represent themselves, this is actually an area where we are making progress. About 5 years ago, there was a big case that challenged the idea that people who are mentally ill could be removed by an immigration judge without being appointed a lawyer. And now there's this great program, it's called Franco, and essentially, you will, if the immigration judge identifies someone as being mentally ill, they will appoint them a lawyer in immigration court. Normally, people in immigration court, have no right to an appointed lawyer, but we're carving out these small groups of people who might soon, under the law, have a right to an appointed lawyer. The Ninth Circuit is considering en banc right now the the issue of whether children should be appointed lawyers in their immigration proceedings. Initially, the three-judge panel denied that appeal, but at least half the judges of the Ninth Circuit voted to rehear that case. And so it's possible that the Ninth Circuit could come out with a decision saying, no, children have a right to be represented by a lawyer in immigration court. Violence and poverty in Central America is, I think, possibly one of the most disturbing, critical factors that affects our immigration situation right now. Guatemala has a poverty rate of, I believe, 50%. Honduras has a poverty rate of 60%. I'm not sure exactly what El Salvador is, what their rate is. But most of what you are seeing on the southwest border right now is the result of this. There is a huge amount of gang activity, there's a lot of violence, there's a lot of extortion, there's very few opportunities for stability. And until that is somehow addressed, I don't see an end to what's going on right now. I don't see a stemming of the flow of people coming and trying to apply for asylum in the United States. So that is a huge concern. What gives me hope is this idea that I've been hearing about lately, probably started maybe 4 or 5 months ago. It's the idea of a Central American Marshall Plan. As we all know, the Marshall Plan was this post-World War II program that basically helped to rebuild Europe. And so a lot of politicians are talking about this idea now. What if we had a similar infusion of money and talent and resources that could help rebuild Central America in a way that would make it so it was less likely that people are going to have to flee? So I'm very sort of hopeful about that idea, that it may take off. And I would love to see how this develops, because I think there is no way to enforcement our way out of this crisis. I'll just say that. As long as you have poverty and people fleeing because they fear they're going to be killed, there is not going to be a fence you can build, or a law that you can make, or a jail that you can put people in that is going to stop what's happening right now. What you need to do is basically create a situation where people are not going to feel the need to flee in the first place because of violence, because of fear, because of poverty. Obstacles to legal status. One of the worst things that happened to immigration law in the last couple decades is a bill called IRA, the Illegal Immigration Responsibility Act of 1986. It created all of these new ways of deporting people who are currently here and keeping people who would, have the otherwise ability to come here outside of the United States. So, for instance, if you come to the United States and you overstay your visa, and you overstay your visa by about 6 months, if you leave and then try to come back because maybe you have, you married a U.S. citizen, something like that, you've triggered a bar. If you stay for a year, you've triggered a 10-year bar. If you get deported and then try to illegally come back and are caught, you are barred for life. Now, sometimes there are pardons you can ask for, but the thing that this does is it basically triggers a situation where if people have triggered this bar, they are not going to try to go in the right way. They're not going to try to go through the legal process. They're going to say, well, I'm barred. I might as well just try and get back to my kid by entering illegally, because my kid is in a hospital in Tucson, Arizona, and there is no way that I'm not going to do everything I can to go there. So I think to address some of these bars that are set up is really necessary before we have the idea that people aren't going to try and come back. Quotas on visas. So right now, if you are for instance, a U.S. citizen, and you put in a visa for your brother or sister, the wait time is about 20 years. So again, if you're in a situation where you're the brother or sister and you think, I have to wait 20 years to have any way of getting a legal status in the United States, again, it just sort of sets up a system where it is encouraged that you are going to enter illegally, particularly if you have issues of poverty, violence, family in the United States. Criminal bars. The IRA, the Clinton law in 1996, vastly expanded the legal grounds on which people could be found to be deportable or ineligible to get status. And for instance, it used to be that you, to have an aggravated felony, you had to have a certain type of pretty serious crime and you had to serve at least 5 years in prison. Now a misdemeanor can be an aggravated felony. It could be something that you never did any jail time on. It could be something you got probation on. So the definitions of crimes that we use to keep people out or deport people have vastly expanded. The state and local protections of immigrants. Again, I think 15 years ago, I never ever would have imagined that all of these cities and states would be passing these ordinances saying, no, ICE can't turn this person over. No, you can't, advise immigration that this person doesn't have lawful status. And that's huge. I can't believe sometimes that that's happening as often as it is, but I think it's really, it gives me some hope. The absence of the functional guest worker program, I think that, what kept immigration as a functional thing for a certain number of years is the ability that people had to come in and work for a couple months, and then, if they made a little money, they could go back home part of the year, come back. Now, because of the really heavy trend towards enforcement on the border, people are coming and staying rather than doing this sort of cyclical seasonal work. So if you have a functional guest worker program, people who are not necessarily fleeing violence are going to have kind of a safety valve to get some income to, frankly, do a lot of work that a lot of other people in the United States aren't willing to do, and to not necessarily stay here permanently, but to keep their family and their home base in another country. Cheesy TV storylines on immigration. When I need some sort of escape and I watch a really cheesy legal show or something like that, invariably now, there's always the immigration storyline. They'll have the immigration episode and this person's getting deported, and sometimes it drives me crazy because they get the law so wrong. But I am very excited about the fact that this is now a thing. And when you see it in these cheesy, TV dramas, it's usually almost always sympathetic towards immigrants. And I appreciate that. Now, short-sighted trade policies. So just to go through this kind of quickly, there are, in 1994, NAFTA passed. It meant that small-scale Mexican corn farmers were competing against heavily subsidized U.S. farmers. Prices in Mexican corn plummeted. 5 million Mexican family farmers were displaced, and immigration rises by 79%. So you've got this kind of cause and effect where our trade policies, our foreign policies, they all contribute to the immigration effect that we end up with. So I would love to see there be more cognizance or foresight in terms of how our trade and our foreign policy affects immigration. The transformation of Arizona, this is my last one. When I moved to Arizona in 2005, these 3 people basically ran the state. Andrew Thomas was the Maricopa County attorney. He was prosecuting huge numbers of immigrants for essentially trespassing, using state law. He was going after pro-immigrant advocates. And then Sheriff Joe, who some of you may have seen, was basically doing a lot of just state-sanctioned racial profiling. he was not shy about the fact that he would pull over people because they looked Hispanic. And then if there was anything that he could do to turn them over to ICE, he absolutely would. Russell Pierce was one of the big proponents behind SB 1070, the Show Me Your Papers bill. And so when I came in 2005, I thought these guys are running the show, and there is no way they're going anywhere. And then, in 2012, Andrew Thomas was disbarred. In 2016, Sheriff Joe lost his re-election, and he was found guilty of contempt. Now, he was pardoned, but he was found guilty first. And then, in 2011, Russell Pierce was recalled by the same voters who had elected him only like a year before. And I need to remember this sometimes, because when it seems like there's people in office who are so entrenched and they're so powerful, the Chris Kobachs and the Trumps and the Jeff Sessions, just wait a little bit. It can change. It can change. So that's sort of my what gives me hope, what makes me lose hope. Often people ask, well, what would you do if you were king or queen? What bills would you pass? And I'm really bad at policy, and I'm really bad at, kind of figuring out what the law should look like. But if I had to name a couple, it would probably be abolish the crimes of illegal entry and re-entry that we talk about, DACA and DAPA, legalization for people who are here without status, an agricultural guest worker program, a rollback of those bars I talked about, and abolish mandatory detention, which is the reason that a lot of immigrants give up on their cases and don't fight their cases, and more protections for asylum seekers. So the last slide that I want to talk about is, here's what's helpful. And I really appreciate you all asking me to come here today, because I think that organizations like this are hugely useful in terms of my work and the support that you give to work that lawyers like myself and others are doing. So what would I ask you to do if I had the ability to very kindly ask you to help out our immigration struggle and your immigration struggle? Continue the pressure, the advocacy, the media, the calls, the votes, all of that. The more attention immigration gets, the easier my job is. Because as long as this all stays in the spotlight, there is more calls for transparency. And that is hugely, hugely important to what I do. Encourage big picture thinking, how immigration relates to other parts of our government decision, trade, foreign policy, other things. Don't just see it as this small, narrow immigration issue. See how it weaves itself into other aspects of what our government is doing. Casting immigration as a moral, religious issue that appeals to evangelicals, I think, is hugely useful. There was a great, wonderful protest in San Diego a couple months ago where it was all clergy, and they came down and they marched down the beach to the border wall goes right out into the ocean. And I watched it and I was transfixed, because there's people in their vestments from all types of religions and denominations, and it was incredibly powerful. I think immigration is one of those areas where we can capture some moral high ground in terms of what would Jesus do. Jesus would obviously welcome the stranger, the foreigner. So I think getting our position in on that and allowing this issue to be defined by us rather than the other side is really helpful. And then the last thing I would say is there's always going to have to be compromise. I don't have any illusions that we're going to get anywhere legislatively without some sort of compromise. But one thing that the immigration community has done very, very well is they've done a good job of not throwing other parts of the immigrant community under the bus. For instance, I have worked a lot with people who have some pretty bad criminal convictions. It would be very easy for the dreamers to say, you know what, just make some really, really harsh laws for those criminal people, and then just give us status. And to their credit, they haven't done that. They haven't thrown other immigrant communities under the bus. They said, no, it's all or nothing. You know, you can't use us as a wedge to try to demonize another group of people. And I think that's incredibly powerful. And I would, well, actually, my mic's out now, so I think that's a great time to stop. So I'm, can you hear me? Okay. So that is basically what I have, and I am happy to answer questions. Happy to hear any comments or thoughts that other people have. Yeah.
Well, here's your chance. Karen will not be here next week. She's here today. So your questions today are very important.
I'm interested in the Marshall Plan idea. I don't think it should be run by the United States, that's for sure. And that did work in Europe to some extent. I'm wondering what you think about letting the Marshall Plan be run by Costa Rica.
I have no problem with that. I agree with you. I think there's really good reasons to not have it run by the United States. Where the resources will come from, where the actual money to do it, will probably be mostly the United States. The question then is the United States going to give up money that easily to have it run by another country? Probably not, but I think that'd work if they did.
Thanks a ton. It's really interesting. So a bunch of years ago, when Rajiv Gandhi was the president of India, the American president and government was trying to get him to accept American insurance, banking, finance, other kinds of capital. And Gandhi said, well, we might do this if you let Indian labor cross your border freely. And of course, the American government said no. So my question is, do you support open borders? Not for capital, but for, in this case, people.
Oh, great. Okay, but I can run a little bit, all right. In theory, yes, I do. If I were just talking about human rights, inherent human dignity, I would absolutely support open borders. I think it would be a really interesting experiment to see what would happen if we did have open borders. That is a concept that is so far out of the realm of possible to me in terms of it being realistic that I don't spend a ton of time thinking about it. And I wouldn't say that I'm out there campaigning for it, because I personally have just found that there are other ways that I think I am better at advocating for things. So in theory, yes. In practice, I think it's really tough.
Let's say why or why not?
Why would I support open borders? Because I don't have necessarily an interest in protecting a person of one nationality more than another. I don't think that my worldview and my theology does not support the idea that if a person is starving in another country, that me being here having food is okay. And so if giving a person the ability to come here and not starve is what it takes, then yeah, I support that. I just don't have a lot of fidelity to nationality. And so if open borders creates less poverty and violence, then I'm all for it. I don't really have a good answer on that, but I hope that is helpful.
Okay, next question here.
Just a comment, Rick. In 2001, The Economist had a survey on immigration, as they typically do in their issues, like article on China trade, something. In November of 2001, The Economist had a nice survey on global migration, and the ratified market solves all ills was tasked with The Economist embracing, let's put labor as freely flowing in the global economy as fiscal capital. That basically died in the aftermath of September 9/11. But ironically, this is, was overshadowed by all of that. But just to say, even The Economist at one time took a bold statement, even within our generation, to task that idea that let's put all the variables of the free-flowing market economy at play. There are millions of things I'd like to respond to here, but grateful to have you here and for taking on the invitation to come for a couple of days with us. There's a quote that comes to mind that I was reminded with in my 15 years of work in migration advocacy. If the hiding of names and faces contributes to evil, then we must put names to faces and stories to people. This is a group that has designed humanitarian and relief organization advocacy strategies and institutions that continue to evolve generation after generation, founded on faith values. And the means to the end to affect change is often through those values, names and faces and stories to people. I like the binary red-green, hopeless, hopeful, because that strategy just withers and grinds, and it's so hard to keep trying to speak truth to power. It's even harder in our own midst, where we, as congregants and citizens, often fundamentally don't realize what it is we're talking about. I don't think we have an honest conversation in our Anabaptist tradition of what citizenship actually means. We have this two-kingdom theology that I think is more mythical to our tradition, rather than specifically tasked to what does it mean to be an Anabaptist Christian with this perceived set of tenets of faith and values that embraces and responds to the complexities of our culture, that responds to these particular issues. And it's the U.S. military that I think would be an interesting conversation to have around this. Margaret Stock and Donald Kerwin have written extensively around the nexus of human security and citizenship. And they've asked the ambitious question, who is it that we say that we are? I don't know, is there a question in there? What advocacy would you have for a tradition that you and I both walk alongside of, but we're intimately part of? What gentle encouragement would you have for us to have conversations about citizenship in the face of this?
Yeah. If I had to say one reason why I do what I do, it is my heritage, my Anabaptist upbringing. I think that, some may disagree, but I think that everything I try to do in my work is very biblically based. Now a lot of people say that, but I think that shouting our values from the rooftops in the immigration context is a great place to start. And the idea of, when you were asking me about open borders, the idea that maybe we shouldn't be quite so tribal. Maybe it shouldn't be make sure my needs are met first. Maybe it shouldn't be a, country over humanity. I think that those are all values that deserve more airtime. And I think that organizations like this that give them more airtime can only help. So that, I guess, is the best response I have.
Okay, next question here.
with regard to the Marshall Plan idea, to what extent has the movement of migrants been influenced by who the U.S. aid has gone to in Central America?
That's a great question, and I don't know enough about the specifics of aid to be able to draw some really good connections with that. Does anyone else have sort of better perspectives on that than I do? I just don't know a lot about some of the direct connections.
Earl Martin.
Thank you for this powerful presentation. I'm wondering how you feel about the strategy to call for the abolishment of ICE as a political strategy.
Abolish ICE is another one of those things that blows my mind, because I have been doing this work long enough. I mean, for a long time it was INS, it wasn't ICE. But the idea of abolishing that is so crazy and radical to me, and I love it. But I have a hard time seeing what it would work like in practice. So I like it, and I have a good friend who just wrote an op-ed on this, and she said, you could probably get rid of maybe at least 90% of ICE, maybe not all of it. So not a full-on abolishment, but a very sharp narrowing of ICE. I think it's more probably powerful as a sentiment than a reality. And to the extent that it is radical and makes people think and challenges the idea that, do we really need this? I think that's really useful. Whether it could work in practice, I am skeptical, but that may just be because I've been doing this for too long with the indoctrinated notion that of course it's always going to be good.
Okay, another question here, and maybe one more.
Hey, Lee.
My question is, with the private detention centers, that to get out of there, people have to pay like $12,000 to $15,000. Well, what's the reasoning there?
So I assume you're talking about bond for immigration. Okay, so the law requires, or the law at least says that the minimum bond that you could give someone would be $1,500, and there's no maximum. So what the amount ends up being varies a lot from judge to judge. In Arizona, there were judges who would give $50,000, $75,000 bonds, and there were some who would give $1,500 bonds. I think that they do tend to maybe center around, depending on the case, center around something like $5,000, $10,000, $12,000, something like that. That is a very judge-driven decision, and you can appeal a bond if a judge gives it to you, but then that goes up to immigration appellate court in DC that is probably not going to overturn it in most cases. I think maybe one of the better ways to go about it is to think about these revolving bond funds, where there's organizations that have, raise money and then essentially pay immigrant bonds, and then when the person's case is over, they get the money back. We started working with an organization called the Bail Project, and for about 2 months during Operation Streamline, what was happening is the Bail Project would come in, they would pay our clients' bonds, which were usually about $1,000 each. If the person was trying to apply for asylum, they would go into ICE custody and start their asylum case. If they weren't, they would get deported and the bond money would come back. And when that happened, their criminal case would get dismissed. So we got about 800 cases dismissed because we had this organization that was paying these bonds. And it was incredibly effective. And because it was so effective, then of course, the government totally changed the system and shut it down so that we couldn't do it for certain reasons. But I think there is a lot of progress that can be made on organizations that have some sort of capital and are willing to use that capital as essentially a loan, while this person is fighting their immigration case. I think that's a hugely effective tactic.
Okay, a closing question, Roman Miller.
This goes back to, I think it's about the first or second slide that you showed. Now, this was an hour ago, so my memory may not be right. But you had a slide that I think it showed a graph with apprehensions, and you had it under the context of border security. Could you connect those dots? In other words, how do you relate the apprehensions to border security? Is that a positive correlation, negative correlation? Anyway, can you just speak to that just a bit more? I might have a follow-up.
So I am not necessarily, I think myself, equating it to border security. I think this is how it is, border security is traditionally seen in terms of, well, let's say it this way. Many people would see that the more apprehensions you have, the more people are crossing, and so the less border security we have. I agree with you, I'm not really sure that's an accurate measure of it, but I think that is how it is frequently seen. But I'd be curious to hear, your take on it.
I mean, if you took that graph and you looked at how many apprehensions does North Korea have, I mean, there's a mindset here that's not right, I don't think, in trying to hook this to border security, regardless of one's politics on border security. That's my only point. And so I spent probably the next few minutes and missed your next 3 points while I was trying to bring things out.
I'm sorry that I was distracted in that sense. So your point would be, North Korea, for instance, doesn't have a lot of apprehensions, and so that doesn't mean that they don't have border security. They have tons of border security. Right, exactly. I agree with that. I am using this more as a metric of how most people, including our government, would see that this is tracking the levels of immigration. In other words, if you are seeing that, say that for every one person who gets apprehended, 2 people get through, then what that would suggest is when the rates were really high of apprehensions, then twice as many people were actually getting into the United States. I don't necessarily think that that's always the case, but I think that that is frequently how it's seen.
Okay. You know what we have? We have one of our own in San Diego, Kara Hartzler. Give her a... And tonight, continuing in the Alpine lecture, time and place.
Hold on, not tonight. Don't show up tonight. Tomorrow night, Tuesday night, 7 p.m. at Martin Chapel. The Kind Lecture Series will feature Kara Hartzler once again. And I forgot to pull up the title. 25 years of wandering around in the desert.
Basically, yeah, basically.
Related to immigration.
And just so you know, if you're interested, I would say probably about half of what I will be presenting at the Kind Lecture is going to be totally new. I'm going to be doing a lot more tracking of the history of some things. So, if you've got your fill, I completely understand. But there will be new things I will be talking about that are not necessarily in this presentation.
And the other thing that we'll have is that will be a reception afterwards, and at the reception there will be 3 of our local organizations that deal with immigrant issues. New Bridges will be there. Virginia Organizing, which is headed by Isabel Castillo, who has been a very prominent dreamer and is pushing things forward. And then also Church World Services will all be set up there, talking about what they do here locally for advocacy in this area. So please come out. Thanks.